and that stuff. I'll fix everything else later. All right, I think, let me just double check here.
I don't see it.
No, I believe we're live. It may not have popped up just yet. There's a little bit of delay. Good afternoon, everybody. Terry, go ahead and kick us off.
Well, good afternoon. Looking forward to today's discussion. We have joining us today Andy Cantrell, and some of you may not know Andy. Andy is up in Minnesota and has had a lot of success in the area of evangelism, and has got a lot of things to share with us we're looking forward to today. So, Andy, we'll just kind of let you get started with your story, kind of how you got into all this and some of the past experiences and so forth.
All right. Yeah, thanks for having me, guys. Good to see you. Glad to be with you today. Yeah, so starting out, there might be some valuable lessons just for people that would like to be doing more when it comes to talking to people about the Lord and trying to figure out how to be more evangelistic. I grew up in a little church in San Diego, California, and we actually went through a few years where there were some preachers who they really didn't believe that evangelism was their work or even that important. I remember one of the preachers one time said, the Great Commission doesn't apply to us at all. Like, that was for the apostles. And the result of that was that we had a friendly church, but there would be people come in and out all the time visiting, and nobody would really say much to them about, hey, why are you here? Or can we help you in any way? I had a father who was a very evangelistic guy at work. Like, he was always talking to people there, and a number of people became Christians because of the things that he did, just, out there on the trucks and in the ditches when they were working for the gas company. So I had a good example of somebody who cared about that. And what ended up happening to me, though, was I noticed these visitors coming in and out all the time and nobody really offering to study with them. And so I was probably 17, 18 years old. And I decided I was just going to start asking each visitor if they'd like to have a study. And I was awkward and I didn't know how to talk to them. I'd walk up to people and say, like, hey, what are you doing here? Or why are you here? And, wasn't long before people would say, well, I'm just trying to look for God. I need some help in my life. Like, I'm going through some hard things, or I thought I'd check out this church. And I'd say, well, that's great. Would you like to study the Bible together? And to my surprise, I'd say 2 out of every 3 people would say, yeah, that'd be great. I don't have anybody to do that with. A lot of them were older than me. A lot of them were, people that would probably not have thought to do that except that I asked. And when they started saying yes, I didn't know what to do about that. I didn't know how to open up the scriptures and teach them anything. So we had these pamphlets there in the track rack. I think they were by a guy named Ivan Stewart. They were called the Open Bible Study Series, and they were like pink and green and terrible looking, but like they just have people read a scripture and then check a box. Did this say that Jesus was the Son of God or no? And people check a box. But what was weird about that is I would sit with people, we go through those, and to my surprise, like, people would become Christians, and it didn't matter that I didn't know what I was doing. There was just material that led them to the scriptures and asked them good questions, and somebody was sitting with them and cared about them. And that kind of thing just really lit a fire under me. I thought, well, man, if all people need is somebody to care about them and ask them and sit with them and look at scripture together, and I want to do more of that, I guess the reason I share that is I think there's probably lots of congregations that exist like that, where people come in and there's people say, hey, thanks for coming, nice to meet you, friendly faces. But you'd be surprised if somebody just sort of steps out of their comfort zone and starts asking people, hey, would you like to get together and talk about the Bible or spiritual things? I can fast forward a little bit. one of the things I do now a lot with our membership is we have workshops and we talk through, like, what would a conversation with a visitor sound like? Like, what kinds of questions could you ask? And depending on how they answer those questions, what path could you go down to maybe get a study with them or invite them to a Bible study that already exists? And I've just over the past few decades honed that ability to get to that pretty quickly and navigate multiple different directions that conversation could go. So anyway, that's a little bit about like my early life, and that's how I ended up preaching. Is I didn't intend to ever be in a pulpit. I didn't really care about that part of things. I didn't intend to make my living with the gospel, but more and more, I just had more and more Bible studies every night through college, and pretty soon I thought, well, if I was preaching full time, I could do this all the time. And anyway, there's lots more to say about that, but that's kind of the beginning of it.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the things that you can kind of key in there is that your past information about like how it kind of went for you, it was not really complicated. Even those old Ivan Stewart, personal workbooks, and I used those for a while too because of the same reason. It was what we had. There wasn't anything else for us to pick from, and I didn't know any better.
Right.
It kind of came down to just willing to listen and sit and talk. And it's a great strength to that simple capacity to say, yeah, I'll do that. And to get a little bit further out of your comfort zone, especially as a young guy, because usually your focus is on other things or other people.
Yeah, for sure. No, I believe pretty strongly. I believe pretty strongly that evangelism, for it to be successful in a place, it's not about having the right presentation. That's not mainly what it's about. In fact, I like that there's lots of options. Big picture of the Bible stuff is out there, and plenty of people have produced material that works. I don't have anything in particular that I try to push people toward. I try to make those resources available. I try to train people to become comfortable with presenting whatever they're comfortable with, as long as it's scriptural. The primary thing is getting people to the point where they're willing to engage people in those conversations and actually sit down with them at some point, and open the Word and begin that journey with them. But to me, that's where most of the training has to take place, is how do you get people to that point? How do you get the membership excited about, believing, fired up that they really can become a part of that? So anyway,
maybe we'll talk about this in the boxes of our time. I've talked to a couple of true introverts lately that are really not outward personalities. Right. And they were asking me, from my perspective, well, how do I help in the growth of the congregation if I'm just absolutely sweating the possibility of being and talking to a large group of people, or even a small group of people, or even one person I don't know yet? And so I'm interested to see kind of how you work with those different personality zones in your present workshop plans. Because I think that's one of the things you brought for us to talk about is the various workshops that you mentioned already. Like, how often do you do those, and how do you incorporate people like that, or people on the other end of the spectrum who are more on the extrovert edge? How do you guide them into success in the present tense, like working with the church up there in Minnesota? How do you kind of fit people into those new roles for them?
Good. Yeah. Okay. Well, let's talk about that. So when I first began preaching, I was in, I did some training in Arkansas for a couple of years. And then my first work by myself was in Los Angeles. And one of the things I did there that worked, but I think it's somewhat of a mistake, is I just did the personal work. Like, I showed up there and I just taught as many people as I could. And it was successful, especially in California. You could get a Bible study with somebody in a minute, No, all you got to do is go up to somebody and say, like, hey, you ever studied the Bible? Most of them will say, not much. And if you say, hey, would you like to? Some of them are like, yeah, that sounds cool. So, I mean, we had studies all the time. There were conversions and things like that, but I just did it all by myself, and I never really taught anybody else to do it. And I don't think that was the right thing to do. Since moving to Minnesota, I've really taken more seriously the instructions of Ephesians 4 to equip the saints. And I've thought a lot about, well, what does that mean? You know, what do you need to equip somebody? That includes their motivation. That includes like the information. That includes how to use the information. You know, there's so many ways to talk about that. So these workshops were actually something that the elders decided to do and put some deacons in charge of it. And I worked with them. And I think that was good, that it wasn't just my thing. But we would do quarterly workshops, like on a Saturday morning or a Monday night. We just say, hey, anybody that wants to get together, we're just going to talk about how to share your faith and how to get into conversations with people about spiritual things. Of course, lots of different personalities showed up for that. Introverts, extroverts. And we tried to make it clear this isn't just for the people that think they're going to sit down across the table and teach a Bible class. Like, let's get together and talk about this. So our very first one, I don't remember the number of people we had. It was a pretty good number, maybe 50 or so showed up. And I asked, the first question I asked turned into what became kind of the foundation for every workshop after that. I said, all right, why do we struggle to talk to others about God? Why do we struggle to start conversations? Like, what are our reasons for not doing that as much as we should? And I didn't let people just give a quick answer. We spent probably 20 minutes to a half an hour with some silence until people would finally speak up. And it was cool to hear everybody say it, you know, around each other. Some people said, I'm just scared to death. Like, I don't even like to talk to people at all. You know, like, I don't know what to do ever in public or at work. I'm kind of shy. You had people say, well, I always end up getting in an argument if I start trying to talk to people about Bible things. You know, most of the things that were listed, though, were fear-based. You know, I'm afraid I'll mess up a relationship. I'm afraid I'll get in trouble at work. I'm afraid I won't know what to say. I'm afraid. Fear was like probably most of them. But let me tell you what came out of that conversation that became the foundation. And this is something I constantly talk about in the workshops, and it's changed a lot of things for people. There are 4 words that we came up with that categorized all those excuses. And the 4 words that categorized every excuse were craft, courage, consciousness, and care. Going the other way, care was one of the reasons that we don't do it enough. Consciousness was a reason we don't do it. Courage was a reason we don't do it. And craft. Now, I think it's important that those words kind of stay in an order, and I'll explain what I mean by that. How often have you heard somebody say, well, I don't really talk to people about the Bible, or I don't do evangelism because I don't know how to do it. Like, I don't know the verses, I don't know what to go to, I don't have the material in my head. That's a craft question. Like, if somebody felt like they knew how to do that, they might do better. But the truth is, I think that's the caboose. Like, that's the end of the train. That's the last thing that matters. Like I told you, I didn't know what I was doing when I first started, but I figured it out. The reason I figured it out was I developed the courage to ask somebody because it was on my mind, because I was conscious of it. And that all came from the fact that I started to care about souls. So I'm going to go backwards here and talk about how these things work. By the way, if you think about evangelism workshops, you could do 1 million evangelism workshops on craft, couldn't you? How do you talk to an unbeliever? How do you talk to a religious person that is denominational? How do you have a Bible study with somebody that's Calvinistic? You could do craft stuff endlessly. like different ways of presenting things. But let's take a step back. Let's talk about courage. There were two kinds of fears that people would express about evangelism, and I call them noble fears and ignoble, or sort of selfish fears or reasonable fears. All the selfish fears are the things like people are going to think something about me, I'm going to mess up a relationship, you know, all kinds of things that I used to struggle with. Like if I talked to God about it and said, "Hey God, I really appreciate what you did for me, and Jesus, I really appreciate that you died on the cross, but you know, I want people to like me, and I'm afraid that if I talk to them about you, they'll not like me." That doesn't sound right. But think about noble fears. What if I get something wrong and lead somebody astray? What if what if I teach something false? What if because of my demeanor or my behavior, I push somebody off, push them further away? Those are real noble things to think about. And the Bible speaks about those. Paul prayed for us to have our speech seasoned with salt, that we'd know how to respond to people. But again, think of how many workshops you could do on that. Developing courage, working on those kinds of things. Let me run through all four of them, and then I'll ask you guys can ask me questions about it. But step one further back to consciousness. A lot of people said the reason I'm not doing evangelism is I'm just not really thinking about it every day. Like I go to work, I go to school, I do my thing, and at the end of the day, I'm like, oh, I didn't even really take advantage of any opportunity with any other human being to say a good word, to share something, to encourage them in spiritual things at all. So what if people became more conscious? And could you do workshops on that? For sure. All right, but here's the big one. And this is funny because I've done these workshops in lots of different places now. Adults, when I do this with adult Christians, nobody will ever say, the reason I don't do evangelism is I don't care. Like nobody will ever say that. But when I do it with young people, that's almost the first thing they say. Young people, young Christians will be like, well, I guess I don't do it because I just don't really care that much about it. Which is interesting. But here's the thing. When we start talking through this as a group, people begin to be convicted about the fact that that's their problem. That there's not enough concern for people's souls. There's not enough care about what God's doing in the universe in a lot of people. And here's the proof of it. And this will convict anybody. Think about the other ones. Consciousness, courage, and craft. What are we normally conscious about? Like, what's usually on our mind? What's usually on our mind is what we care about. If we care about politics, that's what we're thinking about. If we care about sports, that's what we're thinking about. And then think about when we're conscious of something we care about, how courageous are we to talk about it? I mean, again, go back to politics or sports. People make the morons out of themselves to say whatever they want to say about that because they're courageous about what they care about and is on their mind. You can also talk to somebody who's shy. They're like, yeah, I'm just shy. Have you ever seen a mother, a woman, who is very shy? She's kind of a shrinking violet, doesn't really engage with anybody. But once she has a baby, and that baby is threatened or something like is coming after that child or whatever, have you ever seen what happens to a shy mom who all of a sudden finds her courage and she becomes mama bear? Well, what changed? What changed was she had something she cared about. And all of a sudden, people are courageous in ways they didn't think they could be. Now, finally, go to craft. Why do people get good at things? Why do people get better at any given discipline or activity? Somewhere along the line, it's something they cared about, and it was on their mind. And they were courageous to try different things and fail different times and mess up a project, but they wanted to keep doing it, and they got better at it. Those concepts frame every conversation about evangelism. And at any given moment, you could say, well, why am I not talking to people? Is it really a craft issue? Is it a consciousness issue? Is it a courage issue? Or is it that I'm not caring enough right now about what's going on around me? So if you were to talk to most of the members here that have been part of these conversations, they'll almost answer the question, hey, what's going on with you? And talking about the Lord and sharing your faith and having conversations. And they'll say, like, yeah, I'm not conscious of it lately, or I'm not caring about it, or they know how to diagnose that. Anyway, that's a real brief, like, basis of kind of what we do. I don't know if you guys have any questions about that.
Well, I do. The way I'm kind of framing it and kind of looking it through it and kind of repurposing it into my thought structure. If you get someone to unlock their caring for others, it should be really easy to help make them aware about it and courageous about it and teach them how to be more successful at it. And so it seems like what the primary goal is to simply get them to care enough to do those things. So it leads me to a question. What methodology, what encouragement, what regularity are you using to not be dismissive to someone, but to be encouraging to someone who doesn't care? Once they admit that they don't really care, what's your model to move someone along that edge? To get them to the point where they're like, yeah, I don't care. Like, logically, we can all understand the reasons why they should care. And you could browbeat someone into caring for a little while. But in your workshops and in your practice, and Terry can hop in whenever he wants to interrupt me. That's something he's good at anyway. What are you doing to get that shift, that direction?
Well, and let me add, I think the challenge is that's the hardest thing to fix. If it's craft, like you said, I can teach issues about craft. If it's even courage, I can role play examples of interactions that can build up courage. Or consciousness, I can case study that. But to develop a heart for evangelism, that's the number one problem. It's also the hardest to change. So what have you found to be successful as far as that goes?
All right. So isn't that like, and here's the thing, like, and I don't know how this is going to come out. I don't want this to sound harder than it is. Isn't that like the whole point of what we do when we assemble? Like when we assemble to worship and remember the Lord and get into the Word and do all the things that God designed the assembly to be, it's always been about stirring each other up to love and good works. Paul told Timothy, the goal of our instruction is love. Like all the activities God designed for the church to be doing together were meant for people to count their blessings, remember Jesus died for them. Man, if I know how much God loved me, and I'm thinking about that from week to week, and it's really like what's on my mind, how do I not care that God did this for others? How do I not remember that, like, I've got this great gift that I can share? So us getting back to what the purpose of preaching and assembling is part of it. Now, if you got a bad attitude that exists, if somebody says, well, I just don't care about souls, there's been times where I've said, well, shame on you, like God cared about yours. But there's more subtlety than that. It's us as preachers and as evangelists and as shepherds feeding the flock in a way that when we're together, we're being stirred up to love and good deeds. I mean, and there's a million ways that happens through the content of our preaching, through the series that we preach, through the challenges we issue, in the teaching and preaching. So that's not even so much a workshop thing for us. We don't necessarily have workshops on how to care. I constantly remind people that's why we're together every time, is to learn to care about God's kingdom and what he's doing in the universe, and that we're a part of that. And anyway, that's part of how I'd answer that.
Something that's very true is that no matter what context you're in, you take on the traits of those who lead. Sports, church, family, and that's pretty consistent truth. That's the method of development that takes place. And with that, now you think about the person who might comment and says, well, whenever I start talking about the Bible, I always end up in an argument. One of the questions you can ask, well, why in the why side of the craft is to go back and say, all right, did you learn that? Why were you taught that way? Because they obviously care. Their care is already kicked in. They're obviously aware. That's already kicked in. They're conscious of it. They already have courage, but they've been defeated in some ways. And so the craft side comes into leadership, and leadership hits not only why we love and how we love, but then those are in leadership roles. Evangelists, particularly, if you're going to talk about those guys, you and I, shepherds, those who shepherd the flock, you've got to shepherd the flock from within the flock, and bringing people to those conversations that are of a spiritual level. I'll just lay this out there. I kind of get on a soapbox from time to time. We all know that there are congregations that are simply dying or are just like lumps. Like they don't do anything beyond what they already do. They're not going to do anything beyond what they already do. Some of that is on the shoulders of the leaders in the congregation, shepherds or older men, whatever it is. But I'll say this: if you're a young guy and your congregation has elders, and those elders are going out and being encouragers, go with them. Beg to be on their coattails. That is the only way you're going to improve something like the craft side that says don't go into an argument, especially if you've got an elder that's good at it or an evangelist that's good at it. Just grab onto those coattails and say, please teach me. Show me how to do this better because I'm not good at it. I think that's something that from leadership on down, we need to like demand, not just encourage, like, no, you need to go do this. Stop doing this over the thing over there. Go do this thing.
Well, let me add to what Andy said earlier about worship and meeting together. I think one of the things that is true that I think is often overlooked, sometimes before a church can be healthy about evangelism, there's things within that church that have to be kind of corrected.
Absolutely.
If your fellowship is somewhat tainted or dead, or your worship is stagnant, or the church doesn't get along, quite frankly, you're going to have a really hard time being successful at evangelism. You're either going to have to do it all by yourself, and we've all done that, like Andy's talked about early on. We've all done that. And then you're bringing people into a stagnant, stale fellowship that's not going to receive them, and they're not going to. Your retention rate is going to be terrible. Let's just be honest about that. Or your people aren't going to be involved because they see no reason to get anybody to come to a place that's stale and stagnant. So I think to some people who may be out there and wondering how to make their church more evangelistic, so to say, what they really need to realize is they may have to correct some things within that body, within the fellowship first, in order to get it where it needs to be.
Yeah. No, I completely agree with that. That's true. There's some cultural considerations, I suppose, too, depending on where you live. Like me living in California was a lot different than me being in Minnesota. So I'll just give you this kind of almost like a joke, but it's not. In Minnesota, our number one rule of evangelism is don't invite them to church. That's our number one rule. But in other places, like California, that was a great rule, was invite them to church. They had never been in any. But here, that's not as effective as trying to get studies or get them into your homes or whatever. And I kind of joke about that, but that's true. So one of the things we've talked about is learning to invite is a skill. Some of our best inviters will never be Bible teachers. We've actually got some people here that, man, it seems like anybody they invite to church or they invite to a Bible study comes. And they've even got, developmental disabilities where they're not even able to retain some of the things they learn. But for whatever reason, they're just good at saying, hey, you should come to my church or you should come to this Bible study, and people come. we encourage that, and we say, hey, how do you do that? In the workshops, they get to share how they do that, and other people become, I'm terrible at that. Like, I'm not good at inviting people. So, there's so many things to talk about in this. This is multifaceted, and like I said, we've done workshops for years now, dozens of them, different angles, different aspects, different fine-tuning things. All of that, though, has created a culture and a mindset and a mentality that this is who we are, this is what we're about. Everybody's got a role in it somehow. I'd be happy to share those kind of things later at a different time. I know we only have so much time today, but
Right, we can certainly do some more. We're kind of close to our edges, but we haven't really got into the kind of the third box we kind of laid out for us, because your present tense has a shifting culture. And Andy and I talked a couple of years ago about this same, concept, about where he was at, and his role really is to equip. If the congregation can adopt the attitude that says this can be successful, the rest of it is just nuts and bolts. And any set of nuts and bolts will accomplish a successful outcome, at least from my perspective. I like y'all, I don't have a favorite method. I don't have a favorite Bible class. I don't have a favorite, workbook that everyone has to use because it's my favorite. In fact, I don't have one. I open up the scriptures from where they're at. And I often will ask people, what's the last part of the Bible you ever read? All right, let's read that again. And I just want anything. I don't really care. With that being said, when you're looking to the future, part of this is developing it to the point where you're not the one driving the train. And how have you kind of shifted to the point where you're not the guy? Like, I know because in California, you were the guy. Logically, you've moved to where you recognize you can't be the guy, but for it to move beyond Andy Cantrell, he's the guy who does the coffee shop studies and they're super successful, which is the trope or the stereotype that has been attached to you, not really justifiably so. How are you shifting to the point where, boom, no, that's not the case because I don't do that anymore. I do this so that others can do that. How are you kind of predicting your future to make that more real, I guess?
yeah. Well, when it comes to the tropes of the legends about me, they're mostly all wrong. So, uh,
I
um,
It looks like you're
I
drinking
was under the
coffee right
impression
now.
I was
yeah,
under the impression you had like 25 baptisms at Starbucks last week. That's what I heard.
yeah, right. I baptize people in coffee. That's what I do.
Yeah.
Oh,
No,
that's exciting.
so here's the thing. I did things. This was actually a cultural shift. Me studying in public was something I did in Minnesota because I didn't need to do it in California. But in Minnesota, I needed to get out in public and just meet people. And so I'd read my Bible in public and I'd do my Bible studies in public. And I learned how when somebody'd walk by my table and look at my Bible, I could see them look. I'd look at them and say, oh, hey, do you love God too? Or do you read this book too? And then we get into a conversation. I'll be frank, I'm not as good at it as most of our members. The members that have started doing that, where they go do their Bible lesson at a coffee shop or they take their Bible into a public place, they're way better at it because they're not a preacher. As soon as somebody finds out what I do, they're gone. But when, a dozen other people here just say, oh yeah, I go to this church nearby and, God matters to me and his word's amazing, they make friends and they get invited to things. And so again, I was just sort of trying to model that kind of thing, show people that it wasn't as intimidating as it might seem, and they're better at it than I am, which I'm grateful for. I keep hearing about Bible studies going on. Sometimes there's baptisms, and I don't even know who they are. That was always what I hoped for. But again, I do think it comes back to us having a vision of what needs to be discussed and what does it mean to equip and what conversations need to take place over and over again to get people, reminded of it, stirred up about it. Some people come on board with it. There's a lot to be said about that.
I think one of the powerful things, and we'll kind of move towards a close for this version of the conversation, and we certainly want to probably plan to come back around in the future, is moving Bible study and moving these ideas out of the shadows. That
Mm-hmm.
even though our culture continues to tell us that you can't, you shouldn't, it's not cool, it's not happening, or it's just not even legal, we need to move the conversation to a public space in a
Mm-hmm.
comfortable way. We've got two wonderful members at Eastside who are really passionate about teaching in nursing homes. And so they do that a lot. And you know
Mm-hmm.
what? They're successful.
For
Um,
sure.
and they're learning to get better at it. I go to study in coffee shops because there's people there, and I'm hoping my brethren like yours will see me do it and say I can do that too. But they're much more likely to talk to their neighbor who's not a preacher than me.
That's right.
That I've got that kind of stigma. Oh, you're the preacher, so I really can't share with you anyway because you're the preacher, or you're.
Mm-hmm.
And they think I don't talk to my pastor where I go, so why should I talk to the preacher over there? That's usually like a conversation killer at that point. Um, just moving out of the shadows is a great step. Uh, Terry, from your side, because your evangelistic, activities have followed a different track. They've kind of moved into the realm of the things that you're successful from. Do you kind of see some carryover there of some of those ideas?
Yeah, I'll say that, he talked briefly about the change in culture. I remember one of the lessons I learned early on was I moved from a rural area outside of Nashville into Nashville as far as my work goes. And you would be amazed at how big of a difference 17 miles could make in how you approach evangelism.
Mm-hmm.
And which is just crazy to think of. I wasn't changing states. I didn't even move houses, but I could go eat at the same place in the small town I was at initially 2 or 3 days a week. And I would get Bible studies, and you go to Nashville and you eat at the same restaurant every day, and you don't see the same two people just because of the difference in the culture. Which gets back to what has always been most successful is when we have people who care about the people in their lives, that leads to Bible studies. We've talked about it in the terms of cold call versus warm call, which is more of a business idea than the idea of care, but the principle's still the same. And when we really get people to care about the people they have relationships with that are lost, and that you have this gift you can give them that nobody else does, and to realize that if it's anything else, you're willing to do that. Like I use the illustration often of when we lived in Memphis, and even now, I'll tell you the best donuts I've ever tasted are in Gibson's Donuts in Memphis. Like that's the best donut I've ever had. And how silly is it that I'll tell somebody that passionately, but I won't talk to them about Jesus? And when you really think about it, I care enough about donuts to say that, but I don't care enough about Jesus. Now, being the resident fat guy here, that may make more sense. But at the end of the day, it's just one of those deals where you kind of see how foolish that is at times. And our success largely comes from really, I not put it in these 4 words, and I wrote them down, and I love it. And we're going to work on that here. But what Andy's talked about with the craft and courage and consciousness and care, I mean, that's fantastic. That's helped me a lot today. I know the takeaway for me is really that's been kind of even the way you've put that, and plus you get bonus points for alliteration. I always that's fantastic. So it was a great takeaway for me. That's going to help me, and I know it'll help hopefully Phil and other people today as well.
Yeah, Andy, last parting comments before we close ourselves out here.
I appreciate the opportunity. Like, I just want to see God's people wherever they're at, like, get to the place where they know that they can do some things, that the Lord can do some things through them. Evangelism is God's work. If we're behaving ourselves and talking about Him, He gets it done. So we just need to stir each other up to it. So whatever I can do to be helpful to people, they can contact me. If you guys want to have me back sometime, we can talk about more details about any given number of subjects regarding these training things. But no, I just appreciate the opportunity.
Yeah.
Hey, everybody. I think we can guarantee the interest in having you back. We'll say that publicly. That'll happen again sometime.
Yeah. So as our time has kind of run down to the end, I really want to drive home a couple of key points. One, it's not a problem that's solved by bringing in the specialist per se. You know, we got to get this guy, we got to get this person. It's a
Right.
change of heart will demystify, like Andy mentioned earlier, evangelistic endeavors. And if you change your heart enough to care about someone next door or sitting even on the bus with you in your schools, that's the first real powerful shift that's going to make it work. And realize that you should not be doing it all on your own. I'll speak specifically to those who are preachers. If you're doing it all on your own, it will be successful for a while, but eventually you'll be empty. You can only do it for so long. And so reach out to us. If you got additional questions, send them to Andy. His information will be listed. You can talk to Terry and I. If you got questions revolving around the work of an evangelist, let us know. We're going to continue to try to meet every Tuesday to talk about this stuff. Definitely Andy will be back. Maybe we'll invite Andy to join in with this other two guys we know that are like Andy Amerson and Chris Cantrell. I know that they're really popular, but we'll have to schedule that well. I'm not quite sure if we can pull that off. But everyone have a great day, and hopefully the Lord will provide increase in the harvest around you. Take care, everybody.